Morning. Thank you. Welcome to the Ford Foundation. I'm Zav Briggs, Vice President for Economic Opportunity and Markets. Among other things, I oversee our work on just and sustainable cities, and it's an absolute delight to welcome you here today. The sun is shining. It's going to be a great conversation. It would be even if the sun were not shining, but I thought I would note that it is. We're delighted that you're here. And in a moment, you'll hear from Commissioner Penny Abiy-Wardena, who'll say more about this. But let me say from our perspective at the Ford Foundation how exciting it's been to work in partnership with the city, to work with such a committed administration and a visionary one. New York City is a city with global goals, and it has been fantastic to engage both with the city's effort to link the goals of just and sustainable cities, and a whole host of implementation efforts that you'll hear about, and also, of course, to engage in the global process of thinking about how central cities are and how central urbanization, urban development is to meeting the sustainable development goals, the worldwide goals. It is worth taking just a few seconds to note that cities matter not only for what happens within their borders, but for how they affect everything else, including rural communities and resource flows and so on. But for so many reasons, cities are absolutely central, and that makes today all the more exciting. Here at the Ford Foundation, we were early supporters of the effort to develop a so-called urban SDG, goal number 11, to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we've been very pleased to work with an international network of partners to see that come to fruition. And also, in case you're not aware of it, I'll just take a moment to mention a philanthropy platform to help foundations around the world coordinate with each other and engage in a meaningful way with the process of debating the SDGs, and now moving on to, of course, implementation. To prepare for the launch of that, we held meetings, we supported meetings in a number of world cities, and I want to be fair to them. New York was one, but also Jakarta, Lagos, Nairobi, and Bogota. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome you. It's fantastic to be having a conversation about the work right here in New York City, but also to look outward to the world. I will note, and anyone on the panel would say this, there's expertise throughout the room. These folks are going to kick off a conversation, but it is meant to be that with all of you. So let me stress that. And without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome our partner and friend, New York City Commissioner Penny Abiy-Wardena. Penny, please.
Thank you all for coming out this morning and joining us. I hope the breakfast is good. Ford Foundation, Zav, thank you so much for being such a strong partner in this work of ours. As Zav mentioned, I have the honor to be New York City's Commissioner for International Affairs. I don't know how many of you know, but this agency's been around for about 50 years, and the Mayor's Office for International Affairs, our focus is to work on and strengthen the connections between the United Nations and its host city, New York City. And as my boss, Mayor de Blasio, has said, the United Nations is a blessing to not only the world, but it's a blessing to New York City. And today is a very special day in our relationship, and we really can't thank Ford Foundation enough for letting us launch this today. I'm thrilled to be here to launch this series, and I realized brought one of these up with me. We were so excited to get this hot off the presses yesterday. But this really is an opportunity to launch a series that deepens our connection with the UN, not just now, but for years to come. Global Vision Urban Action, as you will experience here this morning, is designed to explore the connections between OneNYC, the innovative blueprint for New York City's future, which was launched on Earth Day in April, and the ambitious new global sustainable development goals, which were adopted in September. In today's discussion, local opportunities for achieving global results, we're going to pull up to the 30,000-foot perspective to reflect on how New York City and the world community came together to create their respective development agendas. And we're going to ensure how they're going to be implemented. That really is the question that is challenging all of us looking forward. In future events that we're going to do under this series, we will focus on specific issues from climate resiliency to early childhood development and ask you about your experiences in making progress. This is really a conversation that we are starting with you, both our city, diplomatic, and civil society community. You all have this booklet on your table, A City with Global Goals, which illustrates some of these synergies. I hope you'll take this back to your office to reflect on the issues that you would be most interested in exploring. This series is really hearing and engaging with you. So what is of interest to your respective countries, agencies, and organizations? We want to hear back from you. Now, we are very fortunate to have 4 leaders with us who have been essential to the process and success of either OneNYC or the Sustainable Development Goals. Ambassador Kamau is the ambassador and permanent representative of Kenya to the United Nations. For much of the past 5 years, Ambassador Kamau spent day and night working on the SDGs, first as co-chair of the UN Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, and then as co-facilitator for the intergovernmental negotiations on the post-2015 development agenda. Prior to becoming ambassador in 2010, the ambassador spent 25 years working with various entities of the United Nations, including UNICEF and UNDP. Next to him on his right is Nilda Mesa, who is the director of New York City's Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Nilda brings extensive environmental experience at all levels of government, public and private sectors, including at the White House and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She has been critical in shepherding the creation of OneNYC, and as the director of the Office of Sustainability, Nilda coordinates the de Blasio administration's environmental agenda and leads implementation of 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, as well as all of our major green buildings plan. Thomas Gass, at the very end, is Assistant Secretary General for Policy and Coordination and Interagency Affairs in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. In this capacity, he provides leadership in promoting and coordinating implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda at the UN. And then Mindy Tarlow is our last but certainly not least. She is the director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Operations. Mindy brings nearly 30 decades. It probably does, actually, given the amount of work that you're doing. Mindy brings nearly 3 decades of management experience in government and the nonprofit sector, as well as a deep commitment to public service. As director of the Office of Operations, Mindy oversees performance management for the city's commitments made throughout by New York City agencies under OneNYC. And she also oversees New York City's Center for Economic Opportunity and the New York City Office of Data Analytics, as well as the 311 system. And I don't know if you know, but we get a lot of requests from the international community for learning opportunities, and a lot within the international community want to learn about our 311 system. So thank you so much for your work. We will use our time here to have a 2-part discussion. While everybody is on stage at the same time, what we're really hoping to do is focus the first part of the conversation with Ambassador Kamau and Nilda to focus on the development of the respective agendas and the attendant challenges in prioritizing and developing content. And then I'm going to turn to Mr. Gass and Mindy to focus on implementation of the goals and that have been developed, and to find out how we're going to move forward. And also for the social media enthusiasts that we have in this room, I don't think it's up, but our hashtag is hashtag NYC by SDG, so NYCX SDG. So we hope you will tweet. Thank you. So, Ambassador Kamau, I'm going to ask you the easy question. So, the process of identifying, developing the SDGs lasted 3 years, involved extensive work by the UN General Assembly Working Group, which you co-chaired. And throughout the process, there was a very serious focus on how the new goals will be universal and how to help improve the conditions for everyone, not just those that can easily be lifted out of poverty. So you had 193 member states. And they needed to agree upon 17 goals and 169 targets. And so I would love for you to share with us how, one, you were able to work with all of these member states, one, to maintain focus and political will over the course of 3 years, and then how you were able to come to a successful outcome which has equity at the core.
Well, thank you very, very much, Commissioner. First of all, it's really nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's nice to be here, particularly with the individuals that I'm with at this podium. I'm a great admirer of the city, having come here as a student and ever since for 30 plus years, almost every year. And I've seen it transform itself in remarkable ways. So I must say it's an amazing place to be. We, of course, have, it's a story that's well known, I think. The experience that we went through over the last 3 years, and what was in fact never known, the outcome of which was never really known. We did not set out to put together 17 goals. Nobody would pick such a number. And definitely not 169 targets. As it turned out, that's what became of it. The original challenge was how to embrace the challenges that the world found itself in at the turn of the century, where the old systems that had been put in place to try to respond to global challenges on poverty, global challenges of maintaining growth and prosperity, global challenges around issues of environment and sustainability, global challenges of trying to make this a just and equitable world, how all these things were going to be put together in a coherent global strategic response. That was essentially the marching orders. And we came out of the Rio Summit in 2012 almost stunned by the fact that we had put together such an amazingly ambitious outcome that nobody really quite understood how we were going to be able to pull it all together. So a couple of processes were set in motion. One dealing with just a group of international leaders, the President of Liberia, the Prime Minister of UK, the President of Indonesia, and one other head of state, who of course I should remember and I don't. And they started off one process. Another was started within the UN to try to see how they were going to respond to this. And then a third process, which was considered as just highly innovative and almost riddled with risk, was this third track where you were going to get the membership of the United Nations to come up with something coherent. Now, who would have thought that would have worked, right? So we got set off, and to cut the long story short, as the weeks and months went by, minds began to focus. People began to realize just the significance of what it is that we were doing and how very, very important it was that it worked.
Right.
And then, surprise, surprise, member states took ownership. And the moment member states took ownership and brought in their governments, their cities, their municipalities, their civil society, their religious organizations, and all became bought into this project, suddenly it took on a life of its own. And really the task for us as the co-chairs and co-facilitators was to try to keep this thing tracked right. The energy, the intelligence, the vibrancy was coming from the membership. And the lessons were coming from cities and communities and around the world.
How is equity understood in that conversation?
It was a huge debate.
Yeah.
We had to bring in professors from all over. Equity is understood differently in different parts of the world.
Right, yeah.
Equity is understood differently in single cities.
Right.
And you remember at the time we started this, the mayoral elections were off and running here. The Tale of Two Cities was played right into it. The idea that you could not have a world where, we were having such huge divergence between the rich and poor, between what was just and unjust. This whole debate kicked right into it. And we just simply had to manage that debate. But at the end of the day, the membership itself began to realize and to define what it felt was the comfortable definition. And if you look at goal 10, and in fact, if you look at goal 16, and if you look at all the goals that have to do with education, with health, with what have you, inbuilt in all those goals are issues of equity, just societies, fair play, and so on.
That's an excellent transition to OneNYC because of those conversations. So when we look at the long-term strategy we have for the city, we have 4 visions. We have growth, sustainability, resilience, and equity. And I want to say that coordinating and working with 70 city agencies who probably haven't worked with each other before probably felt like 193 member states at certain amount.
70 member states. Yeah.
Exactly, 70 member
70
states.
whatever, yeah.
But you've described the OneNYC process as one that has been very comprehensive. And so I would love for you to tackle one in terms of how you and your team prioritized an inclusive approach, which has been core to Mayor de Blasio in terms of how we formulated OneNYC. But what challenges and surprises did you see arise, given that many of these city agencies had never worked with each other, but then all of a sudden we're tackling 4 visions, one of which was this very strong equity lens?
Well, first off, thank you for having us here. This is a treat to be able to talk about a project that's very near and dear to our hearts now for the last year or so. What we did was we started out sort of taking a step back rather than shooting forward with things, and so we said, okay, 1625 was the year that New York City was founded. 10 years from now marks the 10th anniversary. 10 years from now marks the 400th anniversary of New York City as a city. What is it that we need to do as a city to set the stage and lay the foundation for the next 100 years? And what is it that we should be looking forward to for our children, and what future do we want? We started out with, there was a lot of work that had been done before we kicked off this process, and I think that work really allowed us to have a certain set of shared goals and priorities. And so what we did was we had it was like 8 different interagency working groups that were all organized around certain core themes that Mindy and her team and others had worked on through the course of the year before. We said to the agencies, take off your agency hat and come here as New Yorkers, and it's okay. We'll have plenty of opportunity later on to sort of, feed in the usual governmental stuff and the budget discussions and whatever. But, start out with, your agency hat off. And what is it that New York City really needs? That freed up a lot of the very smart people who were involved in this process, from the beginning. The interagency working groups organized around particular themes also freed them up. And so one of the things that we found was that, and I've been involved in a lot of interagency processes before, although not, at the city level. And unlike a number of other interagency processes I've been involved in before, agencies were asking to join. So what we found was that by the time, the further along we got in the process, the more people were asking to be part of it from all different agencies. And so we'd get phone calls from, FDNY or other agencies that you would think don't really have that much to do with sustainability, but they saw that there was this angle, that there was, something where they could really contribute, and that made a huge difference. And one of the things that we saw were that there were certain kind of cross-cutting themes and cross-cutting initiatives that would come up, independently through different groups. And at some point in the process, we sort of pulled back and looked at, what were the things that were coming up that were shared amongst different groups, and then we sort of reorganized everything, and that's when we came up with the 4 visions, the 4 lenses. We also relied on a lot of research. So one of the things that we're required to do under city charter is look at, as we're doing this long-term planning process, is look at population growth. And so we found that population is now 8.4 million, more or less, and going to be 9 million. We also found that growth was occurring most rapidly in the boroughs outside of Manhattan rather than within Manhattan, which has all kinds of implications for things like, job growth, transportation, access to, economic opportunities and so forth, as well as things like air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of the more traditional areas. And the other thing, another key thing that we found was that while New York City it has the most jobs that it has ever had, it also has the largest difference in, sort of the haves and the have-nots. So it's like 47.1% of New Yorkers are either in or at the poverty, near or at the poverty level, which is a tremendous number. And as the mayor quite often says, you can't have sustainability without having both economic as well as, the traditional environmental sustainability. And so, and I have to say, with all of this, it helped to have a deadline. We had a crazy time period, but there was something.
Can you share that with everyone?
It was like 3.5 months.
Yeah.
So, in effect, and so, but with a lot of work that had already, been done. And so one of the things that did was it forced people to, sort of decide quickly and to, sort out what was truly important and, what was less important. And then, layering on top of that considerations like the budget process, which, also tended to clarify, the priorities. It all kind of wound up somehow coming together in this, format. So we have something like 200 initiatives. We've carried forward the, 200 or so initiatives from Plan YC, and so the ones that are not complete, we're still tracking and still, doing those. And it's Mindy's office and her team who are doing the, the nitty-gritty of tracking, the metrics and, the progress and so forth now that the agencies are, implementing. But there's, as you say, there's a tremendous amount of ownership with the agencies, and I think that just sort of spurs the whole thing forward. It's not City Hall sort of dictating to agencies, that you must do this, or hey, we came up with this great idea, now go execute. They really help develop it. They really own it.
And it's interesting because that is the theme in terms of how you were able to get to the final agenda, is that there was this support, this innate understanding of how important it is to do what you need to do. But at the end of the day, every country is going to have a different priority, hence the 17 goals, 169 targets. But how did you manage the diverse and conflicting sort of interests of the stakeholders? Because you're not only dealing with member states. I remember you and I were talking about the importance of the private sector. The civil society was key in informing. How was that management of all of those different stakeholders managed?
I think the key to that is a very simple mantra, if you want, that we are living in one world. That this is indeed a collective enterprise. Protecting the world, managing our environment, driving prosperity, global prosperity, because no country is an island, no economy is, with globalization, is unconnected to another. All these things became self-evident as we continued to have this debate through the weeks and months. And even though we had huge diversity, I don't want to mention countries, but we all know the countries on earth, and we know the diversity of those countries. We were able to keep people very focused on what were the essential deliverables for driving prosperity, for fighting poverty, for building resilience, for ensuring sustainability. And it doesn't matter which country you're from, all those things matter to you.
Right.
The question was, how could you work with other countries to ensure that you're in a better position to deliver on what you want to achieve in your own country? And if you can get people to understand that this is about helping themselves, and finding opportunities by what's presented by other countries and and from experiences from other countries that can come to bear on your own experience. Getting people to appreciate that gives them ownership, and they then become very determined to see an outcome that will empower them to do this.
Out of curiosity, how do you get them to appreciate that? And I don't even say that in a joking kind of context, but rather, are these collective conversations that you had, did you feel people were more receptive in group settings, or were these more one-on-one, really bringing it down to?
The UN membership is loath to be broken up into workshop arrangements and groups.
Good to know.
They find it paternal and just
Noted.
insulting.
Okay.
I remember at one point we did actually try to go down that track. We were going to have a colleague of ours from Colombia, who's really bright, she's now at the World Bank, wanted us to go off into workshop and retreats, and I mean, you might as well have insulted them. There was such a visceral reaction. The membership likes to operate collectively. They want to see what everybody else is doing.
Okay.
You're keeping an eye on each, and the political undertones remain throughout the process. And you have to manage those political undertones in a room. And when one person says something on this end of the room, you can almost feel the reverberations on the other end of the room, as the political interpretation of that statement is completely and utterly different in a different part of the room. So you have to keep people in the same room in order to give people comfort and to manage that and ensure that the comfort levels remain such that you're able to keep the ball moving forward. And this was the challenge at all times. And the intellectual part, if you want, the technical part, which was very, very difficult because it had never been done before, was actually a lot easier, because you could go home, speak to Thomas Gass and the other big brains of the UN, pick them, figure out how you want this to work, and then come back to this membership trying to figure out, okay, how are you going to make this sell so that North Korea is feeling just as comfortable as the United States on this issue. Now that's a task.
That is a task. Well done, sir. Nilda, before we transition into the implementation part of the discussion, I know that you've worked in international context. This is something that the mayor was very much thinking about, and I'm curious if any, how did you consider that in the sustainable development piece of OneNYC? As the ambassador said, the tale of two cities resonated as they were having the equity conversation. But I know, we're in New York City, the SDGs are being debated over here. I'm sure that influenced in some way.
Yeah, one of the things that was important was that we had a sustainability advisory board, and one of our co-chairs is Jeff Sachs. And so there was a lot of interaction and sort of, cross-feeding. I mean, he was very good at keeping us informed as far as, sort of some of the big ideas that were coming out of the SDG development. And, so we had a very good interchange there. And we knew, sort of generally what was going on. And then in, September or whatever, it was great to see, so many of, the themes that were coming out of the final adoption that were, tracking with, what we had come out with before.
That's great.
So it was, it was sort of like this vertical and horizontal kind of interchange and diagonal and,
and it
multiple
happened.
dimensions. Yeah.
Well, that is a good transition into Mindy, who now we have OneNYC thanks to all of these efforts. And that includes 28 outcome-oriented goals, over 200 initiatives, and 62 indicators for measuring progress. And what I think is really important here, too, is that each initiative is assigned to an appropriate agency with a funding source, so that we are guaranteed that there will be some sort of deliverable. Now, how within your context as the director of the Mayor's Office for Operations, can you explain to the audience how city government is implementing and monitoring the management of OneNYC, but also importantly, how are city agencies coordinating these efforts in the implementation process, and what role do you play, if at all, in that?
Sure. So over my 30 decades work on these issues. I've come to learn many things. So I would say a couple of things. One thing is that the Office of Operations monitors performance management and project management all across the city for individual agencies, but most specifically around multi-agency initiatives. So this is, in some ways, the largest multi-agency initiative that we're working on. So it fits into a structure that exists already. How we track commitments, how we create milestones around those commitments so that you know that things are on schedule or not, and also how we develop indicators and then track to those indicators. OneNYC presents huge opportunities for the whole city to come together around the initiative, but it still has that fundamental core. And Nilda said something before that we actually talked about in the green room, this notion of things that are horizontal versus things that are vertical. This issue cuts across all agencies and yet can go very deep within certain agencies or clusters of agencies. You know, like this notion that Nilda mentioned around population growth in the outer boroughs and what that means. So what that means is, where are the jobs for those folks? How long does it take for them to get to those jobs? If we want to look at commute times for people in outer boroughs, what should that be and how can we track that? Very complicated methodology, and something that we're looking at so that we can come back together and say that we have are achieving that goal or on our way to achieving that goal. So the way that we've structured it is we had a steering committee when we put the whole plan together. We now have kind of an implementation committee that mirrors the steering committee, and operations is playing the role of making sure that we're tracking every commitment and that we are tracking every indicator. And I just want to look at those two different ways for a second. When you're tracking a commitment, it can be a performance that you're tracking, but it's really about, is the thing getting moving? So it's a new thing, you have to put a contract in place, for example. You have to hire a lot of people. You have to make sure that you're meeting certain kind of tactical goals. That's one thing. But then when you're saying, well, what are the outcomes? Let's use universal pre-kindergarten as the example. So on the one hand, you want to have more opportunities for 4-year-olds to have a seat in a pre-kindergarten program near where they live. So one thing is very tactical. Do we have the contracts in place? How many seats are there? Where are they? Speaking of FDNY, it was funny that you mentioned that, Nilda. You would think, what would the fire department have to do with universal pre-kindergarten? Well, every school's got to be inspected. Every school's got to be meeting certain fundamental guidelines for safety of children and teachers, et cetera. It's a very comprehensive effort. But it doesn't stop there. So yay, good for us. We got the seats that we said that we would. Now you have to make sure they're filled. You have to make sure that you've got the right kind of analytics in place to identify those 4-year-olds, make sure that they're applying, make sure that you have a whole process in place for that. Then you need to manage to those outcomes. How many people did we say we would put in a pre-K seat? Are they there or not? But then is the ultimate test is, what does that mean? You know, are people better prepared? Are children better prepared to go into regular school? And then ultimately, you know, the thing about OneNYC is you're in it for the long haul. What happens 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? What is our expectation of how that will impact both the education outcomes of our children, but also their movement out of poverty, if they're in or at poverty, their earnings, their family health, et cetera. So, you know, just using that example as a through line, that's really affecting every domain that we think about. And as Nilda said, we started out in these sort of, you know, groups that cross different specific domains, but ended up really seeing that those things come together around the resilience and equity and growth and sustainability of our city.
So Thomas, that was one example for New York City, which sounded overwhelming, just around universal pre-kindergarten. And you know, in your current role, but in in your career, you've worked on developing many global programs. So I'm just going to ask you an easy one. How is the UN monitoring the goals and measuring the impact, not only on the global scale, but really at the local level too?
Well, I mean, we have to realize that this is an agenda that has been put together by sovereign nations.
Right.
And they don't want the UN to be the police of what's happening at the national level. So I think here we have to realize that this is a different kind of agenda. It's not one that's going to be rolled out from the top to the bottom. As we've just heard from Ambassador Kamau, it's one that was built by 193 countries, by hundreds of interest groups who came in through the doors and helped to release the emotional intelligence of this institution.
Right.
You know, over 5 million people were surveyed to ask them, okay, what do you want? And so when you have such a process, at the end, you already have a shared vision. You have a shared vision of humanity. That has to now become a social contract. A social contract between the leaders and their people. And they came here to promise. They came here to pledge that this is to pledge to their people. Much more than to pledge to each other, I would say. And this is what is important.
That's a good
This is what has to trigger a dialogue at the national level. This has to become part of national politics. This has to become part of local politics now. And that's why I'm so excited about this process and the link with the work that you are doing here in New York City, because this is exactly what it takes. You see, the goals, when you see the pictures up there, I mean, you can barely read the little text, which is already abbreviated, and some people are criticizing us and saying, no, it wasn't exactly that. It was much more complex, etc. But this is not about any of us remembering all the 17 goals and all the 169 targets. Even those of us who are working on it on a daily basis, we don't know. But it is about us knowing that these goals are clickable, that this social contract has small print. And the small print are the targets. And the targets are relatively concrete, about as concrete as you can get with 193 countries in a room. And I think what is really important is that individuals can connect with that, and that everyone in this room knows which one is your favorite target and which one is the target that you're going to contribute to, and as an institution, as a city. And now as a city, you've already chosen 4 or 5 goals that you will be contributing to, and a number of targets. And this is what is going to make this agenda gel. If individuals can identify with one issue, whether it is to get a road to bring their products to the city, whether it is to be able to get a health center close by, whether it is I just worked for 4 years in Nepal, and whether it's to get a bridge to get across that valley so that you can go and vote in the district center, you know, and so that you can register your kids, because otherwise you don't exist in today's world.
That's right. But then that's an important distinction, that the UN's role is not here to police the sovereign nations around this idea of a social contract, which is an excellent way of putting it. What role does the UN have, and what role are you playing and your team playing in the coming year in terms of supporting the different nations in how they implement, or how they choose to implement?
I would say we have to create the dashboard, the global dashboard, where everyone can see how are we doing. But we also have to create a space where this policy dialogue continues, because this wasn't the end of a process. This was the beginning of a process.
Exactly
That's right.
Yeah.
And
That's right.
you know, sometimes when we are in the UN and we diplomats, we tend to hop from one conference to the next, and so we tend to kind of all bundle. It's a package of conferences. You know, we were in Sendai, and then we were in Addis, and then we were in New York, and now we are in Paris. You know, but we don't really realize how these fit into each other. The SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is the roof. It's the vision where we want to achieve. The conference in Paris right now, where all our leaders are, is one of the vital pillars that will hold up and shore up this roof. It's not just yet another conference. It's not a package of conferences. There is a link between them. There is a goal on climate change. And this goal on climate change is being worked on right now. And it's much more complex than just the few targets that are in the SDGs. In the goal number 13. It's much more complex than that, and it will require policy work, it will require legislation, it will require commitments and action and a continuous work. Now, we have to make that conference, that the UNFCCC, the conference in Paris and the following conference next year, that has to become the docking station for a project that shores up this roof, these SDGs within the next 15 years.
Can I just jump in there? 'Cause
Please do.
I
Absolutely.
completely agree with that. And even at the local level, that's true. That, you know, this plan is filled with things that are in our control, but it's also filled with things that aren't in our control. You know, and that if we have a unified front of what it is that we need as a city, as a state, as a country, as a world, whether it's around education or poverty or premature mortality or sustainability, which all of that, frankly, falls under, at least in my head, it's not going to be possible to really make fundamental change. And it's both I'm inspired really by the common ground. When I looked at this, and yes, it's hard to read from there, but when you look at it at your tables, it's actually sort of a remarkable thing about how much common ground there is in terms of the things that we're looking at, the way that we're looking at them, you know, and just the amount of overlap there is on its own is just an unbelievable opportunity, I think, for folks to come together around a common platform and make change.
If I could also just
Please
add
do.
a particular note on the climate work that's being done. I think one of the most interesting developments over the last year or so has been that of the growth of sort of the cities and subnational governments taking ownership of and exercising their leadership within that role. And it's interesting, like, you know, from where we sit, as we try to figure out for our large city, what is it that it'll take, you know, in order for us to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And the mayor set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. We, along with Los Angeles, were the two first cities to sign the Under 2 MOU. You know, but it comes down to, you know, this is where the rubber meets the road. And so, you know, what is it we need to do? And as an example of the complexity of it, we thought, you know, okay, the city's municipal operations take up maybe 10% or so of the electricity demand citywide. And we thought, okay, well, we could actually play a significant leadership role here and a kind of a market-making role here. It's something like 2% of the electric grid comes from renewables, and that's it for New York City. It will take a tremendous amount of change and a tremendous amount of investment and sort of all the, you know, all of the actors aligning just right in order for, you know, the necessary conditions to be set up so that we can meet our goals and so that others can also meet their goals. And that process of figuring it out is mighty complex just at our level, much less internationally. You know? So it's sort of like a fractal kind of thing, you know, where it's sort of, you know, just it's sort of like incredibly complex here, and it's still complex the farther out that you go.
Please.
I was just curious because I was looking at this. I must say I really admire this, and congratulations, because it does exactly what Thomas is saying. Is what we hoped countries would do, is what we hoped cities would do, municipalities out there and so on. I'm curious why you dropped 7 and 14, goal 7 and 14 out of this package. Precisely because of what you just said about energy and renewable energy, and a city like this could with the right technology, probably power most of its energy needs in a significant way using very new and modern energy technologies. And then on the ocean side, again, building a little bit on what Thomas said, just last week there's a resolution that was passed that is looking to have a oceans conference.
Yeah.
Just to put another pillar under this idea of what we're trying to do for the world. And I was just wondering, city surrounded by water and sea and ocean, why 14 and 7 are not part of the solutions that you have here, which I think are just amazing.
We didn't actively drop those. What we were trying to do, especially from a programmatics perspective over the next 2 years, we worked with Nilda's team and the larger OneNYC team that focuses on this. We were trying to identify direct synergies between what OneNYC was looking to do and where we could find those connections. So we didn't drop them on purpose. We were just trying to identify, and couldn't yet, those strong connections.
No, but I
And
think you're right, particularly on 7. On 14, it's interesting because one of the things that, so I grew up in Chicago, which is very conscious of its lakefront and lakeshore and how much a part the water is for the city.
Right.
Here, I've always been struck by the fact that so many New Yorkers don't see themselves as living in a city of islands, which we do. It's an archipelago, really.
That's so true.
And so one of the things that our office is doing, along with some other agencies and so forth, is trying to look at those issues. So we have water that flows into the Hudson that comes from our wastewater treatment plants. We have litter that goes in that harms the marine life that's around there, and it's something that we're really just getting going on, grappling with and sort of starting to put the pieces together. But that consciousness in New York City has not really been. It's been, the waterfront has been an industrial waterfront. It's been a working waterfront rather than one where people look at it so much as a resource and available for other uses as well.
Something we can learn from the SDGs. Before we go to Q&A, Thomas, I want to ask you, how do you see, because we've been talking about cities and local communities, how do you see the SDGs strengthening those partnerships? You talked about the dashboard and the ceiling, given what the nations are doing, but this is not a top-down effort. This has to happen at the local level, and I'm curious how you're seeing that come together at the local level.
I mean, in the UN, we're, I would say, in our baby shoes in terms of making the UN relevant for non-state actors and non-state coalitions and groups. And I certainly think we need to still be creative over this coming year. We're setting up this dashboard to make it really relevant to the business community, to make it relevant to the large INGOs, to make it relevant to partnerships, and to make it relevant to the cities. Maybe we need, we're going to have, by 2030, we're going to have 41 mega cities in the world, with more than 10 million inhabitants. Maybe we should have a website where cities can declare how they're going to contribute to the SDGs and what they are doing. I mean, we'll
sign up.
Yeah, I think this would be great. And I think we need to do that for INGOs. We're thinking about, we're already in the process for partnerships, and the business sector already has an interface through the Global Compact. But these 4 areas, these 4 groups of huge stakeholders are so important.
Absolutely.
And doing a log frame is something that we are able to do. I mean, goals and targets, we all know that it is important. But realizing that we are part of the same global village, and that that it's important that our log frame of our institution or of our city connects to the big log frame. That is the challenge, you see. And that's what you've started to do with this process. And I think, and the question of Ambassador Kamau is very relevant,
Absolutely.
I mean, oceans, it's not just a resource for New York.
Right.
It's also a responsibility.
Right.
And so that side of it, that global public good side of it, you're well placed here with the UN in the middle of the city to have that that connection and to also show the way.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good transition. Would love to open it up to Q&A. Does anybody have any questions for this panel? Please, yes, Jessica. Please introduce yourself and who you're affiliated with.
Sure, I
too.
will do. I'm Jessica Espy from the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and I work for Professor Sachs, who, of course, as was mentioned by Nilda, has been very involved in the process of developing OneNYC, and also it's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to work with Nilda, Penny, Mindy, and everyone across the city over the last few months on this really inspiring plan. I just had a couple of quick kind of questions and thoughts. The first is, I think Thomas said it very eloquently just now about the need to kind of inspire change and the fact that this can't be a top-down process. It's about kind of showing the path and inspiring other people to follow. And of course, New York, I mean, I've firmly believed, and we've been saying it a lot in a lot of public events over the last year, really is breaking new ground in the way OneNYC has been developed and the fact that it is so closely aligned with the SDGs. And I think there's a huge opportunity to inspire other cities around the world to follow, and particularly as we run up to Habitat 3. So, I mean, I think into next year, one thing that would be really brilliant to think about moving forward is how we can use this example and how we can amplify what's happened with OneNYC to try and catalyze a much broader movement of cities signing on to the SDGs, particularly as we go up to the Habitat Conference. It's already started to some degree. There were various events that took place at the Vatican, which the mayor was part of, and there was another event in September that we helped organize, and various mayors from around the world came to, and there's huge appetite and interest there. But I think it would be great if we could really kind of make a concerted effort to push this over the next year. So it'd be great to hear if there's anything in train already, or if there's something that you're thinking about in the run up to that. And then just two other super quick points is that, again, on the idea of how we inspire change, I think there's a real opportunity to, during the process of forming OneNYC, you did a brilliant public consultation process, and you consulted very widely, and it's well documented in the plan. I think now we have the SDGs, there's a real opportunity to have a much more open dialogue with the public and with the general citizenry and with, you know, everyone who's living in the far corners of the city and around the world, to say, this is what the SDGs are, this is the global vision, this is what you've come up with in OneNYC, and to kind of instill that fundamental belief and common vision and what we're trying to achieve, and to kind of make sure that there's an ongoing open dialogue so that people really feel bought into the plan for the next 2, 5, 10 years. And one way in which to do that very practically is, and I'm biased, but I would say is metrics. So one thing I think, you know, people really respond well to is if they can see these are key indicators of performance. This is how we're faring. This is how my community's changed. We did a quick exercise of mapping your 62 indicators against the SDG indicators that are being debated at the moment. And there's about 60% alignment at the moment, which is very impressive already. So I think there's quite a lot we could do to make better well known the brilliant things that you're already doing to measure progress and to communicate what the implications of that are for the SDG agenda as well, both because citizens would find it fascinating, I imagine, but also because the global community would just be so interested.
Right.
So those are just some suggestions and ideas, and I'd love to hear what the plans are in the run-up to Habitat 3.
Thank you. Would you like to respond to that?
So it's interesting. One of the things that I've seen happening, and I've been to a number of conferences that have been sort of city-level conferences over the last few months. And with the release of OneNYC, there are a lot of cities, as you can imagine, who are very interested in how we came up with this and, you know, sort of the approach that we took, to the point where I hear regularly from other cities, my counterparts, as well as their like deputy mayors and so forth, that they're looking at OneNYC as a model for what it is that, you know, they should be doing. I'll even hear from consultants saying, oh, we've been approached by thus and such city, and they want to do what you did, you know. Mm-hmm. and that's how you know it's really true. So, but I think, you know, some of what happens is, so like I will go to these conferences and I will ask, you know, other cities, and I will ask sort of, you know, this network of people, well, what about the SDGs? Are you talking about those within, you know, your city governments? And often the answer is, you know, well, that's the UN and that's not really our thing. And so somehow there's, I think, an opportunity to make that connection so that people can understand and, you know, see how it's really, you know, relevant to what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, and I would say with respect to the indicators being kind of the maybe method of doing that, it's sort of like music, as a universal language. And I think indicators kind of are too, right? So I think that's a real opportunity to bring people together around the indicators of how you're going to track what it is that you're doing, right? It's something that's a universal idea.
Thomas.
And I'd like to add to that, indicators is not equal to indicators. And when we, in the SDGs, of course, we speak of 169 targets, and now we'll have maybe 250 indicators. Those are really global indicators. But we need to have indicators at a local level. We need to have local communities, whether it's the city of New York or whether it's the OneNYC movement. I know this morning I was retweeting some really interesting activities that were happening in South Africa and in Kenya of villages that are establishing their own indicator thresholds and data and doing household surveys and deciding how the global goals are relevant at a village level. Recently also I was in a thematic meeting, Professor Yunus's movement on social business, and they are aligning the whole movement against the SDGs. So whether you're working on a thematic track or whether it's a geographic one, such as the city or a village, you can always see a part of this agenda being relevant to you, but you then need to do a lot of work because you need to create your own indicator system to see how you will fare and what needs to happen at your level so that you can really contribute.
Absolutely. Well, given I want to make sure that we are timely here, I'm going to ask that you're going to keep your questions for the panelists after. We only have a few more minutes before the conclusion of this event. I want to thank you so much again for joining us today. Mindy, Ambassador, Nilda, Mr. Gass, thank you so much. And before we end the program today, and we will have networking time, so please bring your questions to the panelists, I want to recognize that today is December 10th. It's International Human Rights Day. And we've just spent an hour discussing our development agendas at a very high level, at our 30,000-foot perspective. And thank you for Mr. Gass's last comment about really bringing it down to the hyper community level, which is where we need to see the action. But we've talked about the importance of having equity be front and center, and learned about ambitious goals and targets. But at the end of the day, if we don't ensure that all people have a voice, that human rights are respected, we will just not succeed. And this is true here in New York City as it is around the world. And I'm very pleased and proud a number of New York City commissioners came together to think about what freedom means to them and how they essentially sort of live out and embody that freedom with the work that they do here in New York City. And we have a very short video we'd love for you to watch.
We hear the term human rights all the time, but what are human rights?
International Human Rights Day is a day for everyone.
It's our responsibility as free people to help others to be free.
Freedom for us means many different things.
Freedom means a world where girls and women have equal access to opportunity.
Freedom for our families means that every child has the ability to reach their full potential.
Freedom to live in an accessible and comfortable home.
Right to an adequate standard of living, including the right to housing.
Access to safe and affordable homes is essential to the basic human right and freedom that we celebrate on International Human Rights Day.
We remain committed to working with thousands of community-based organizations to help our city's young people have the tools, resources, and support so they can become empowered citizens, so they can improve and change their neighborhoods and our city.
Human rights are our basic fundamental freedoms. They are what bind us, what we all have in common, what we all need. The right to live where you want, to work where you want, to visit public places, to live your life, free from discrimination.
At NYCHA, at ACS,
At HPD, we are proud to play a role in providing housing security to all New Yorkers.
we provide services and supports for families that are grounded in community.
In our office, we work hard to ensure that people with disabilities can live a productive and healthy life.
We enforce the labor laws, such as the paid sick leave laws, and we protect New York City consumers against predatory practices.
We at HRA are doing our part to help people who are food insecure in our city.
We protect this freedom for more than 600,000 New Yorkers who call this great city home.
At NYC Service, we offer volunteering and service year opportunities. We believe that helps individuals to grow and also contribute to their city.
My office is taking this city's tremendous work and connecting it to the global agenda as the world works to uphold women's achievements and close the gaps that remain in ensuring true gender parity.
No matter our backgrounds, identities, or beliefs, we are all human, and we all deserve human rights.
Thank you, everyone.